everyone leave, everyone kind of stay when the committee member are asking questions. You just take over CNS stuff.
Okay.
Sounds good?
Okay. Sure.
Okay. So I think we are set.
Thank you everyone for coming here. As Rush said, it's been a little while. Getting out of here in just shy of 9 years. Hopefully, getting out of here in just shy of 9 years. But today I'm going to be talking about a framework I've been working on called dynamically labeled predictive coding and how it applies to expectations and attention. Particularly, we focusing on expectation, mismatch, and comparison, and then taking a little detour into attention and ignoring. So for expectation and mismatch and comparison, I'm focusing here on a very particular type of surprise. It's when you have very strong expectations about what's going to happen, and then something entirely different occurs. As an example, if you take a drink out of a cup and you're expecting soda, but you get milk. You might like milk, but there's this very strong gut check moment that grabs your attention and makes you think, wait, something just went wrong. Or if you're sitting in a bar talking to your friends and they have a band and they're covering a song that you know and love, and they hit a wrong note. You may not have been paying attention to the music, but you knew what note should come next, and when it didn't happen, that can interrupt conversation. It will absolutely grab your attention and draw it away from what you were focusing on to what just became unpredicted. And towards the end, I've tied this in also to certain artistic elements like plot twists in novels or movies. So the name for this particular type of surprise is associative mismatch. It's a mismatch between an active expectation and the sensory perception that's coming in. I should be clear that this is not just novelty, because novelty is an exercise in recognizing something that you've seen before, or in the case of something that is novel, not recognizing it. But it just requires recognition. This requires prediction, which is a step beyond just recognizing that you have encountered something before. And it's not just something being unexpected, because there are many situations where don't come up with associative predictions. If I just shuffle a deck of cards properly and start dealing them out, you won't have strong expectations about exactly which card is coming next. But if I've been dealing them out in ascending order, by suit, you will develop a strong expectation about what's coming next. And then if I break that pattern, that would be an associative mismatch. So what we're going to try to cover today is setting up this framework for thinking about how the brain handles expectation, mismatch, and comparison. And then we use that to build a model of how mismatch detection and comparison happens in the hippocampus. After that, we try to extend that from hippocampal cortex to neocortex in general, focusing on the mismatch negativity as an indicator of mismatch and error in comparison. And then we take a little detour into ignoring and alpha brainwaves and intentional ignoring. But towards the end of that, I'm going to propose that it actually fits very well in the framework that was originally built for expectation and mismatch. And then I'll talk a little bit about where I'd like to go with this in the future. So in building a framework, there's some important concepts. We're going to be focusing on the representation of the predictions and expectations, the mechanism of comparison, and downstream consequences of match, mismatch. Basically, how the rest of the brain might interpret the output of whatever comparison has been being done. We're not going to look terribly closely at exactly how predictions are generated, like the mechanism for generating a prediction. Kind of assuming that there are brain areas, and we'll touch briefly on that are good at generating predictions, and we'll just kind of take their output and run with that. So most of the time, when people try to model or put forward a mechanistic theory of associative mismatch. They use something that I've kind of lumped together as a subtractive comparator. Basically what this does is it represents the prediction as an inhibitory signal. And then you have excitation coming in from your senses. And the inhibition subtracts away activity from the sensory excitation, and whatever is left over is unaccounted for sensory experience. It's basically a subtractive operation, although not exactly. And so what this often ends up doing in, for instance, a rate-based coding system, sensory input will drive rapid spiking, which will then go up to a memory prediction system, generates a prediction about the next input, which drives inhibitory interneurons, and then those inhibit the same neurons. When the sensory input comes in now, the spiking is less rapid. There are some drawbacks to this, though, particularly when you think about downstream interpretation of the output of these neurons. If we assume, basically, that neurons have a firing threshold, which should not be a horribly big assumption, and that they have to integrate activity to get past this threshold in order to fire. And if we assume that they're not very strongly low-pass filtering their input, then a higher frequency output from our comparator is going to more effectively drive the downstream neurons than a lower frequency output. This would imply that there are greater delays when you are processing an expected stimulus than when you are processing an unexpected stimulus. And that is the exact opposite of what has been found in almost every experimental paradigm that this has been investigated with. We are just faster at reacting to something that we were anticipating. Second drawback is confusability. Because the subtraction process is effectively like a linear operation, what these two blue lines represent are sensory inputs of two different intensities. For instance, like tones at two different volumes. And a high intensity input will always have some level of expectation that will produce the exact same output from the comparator as a relatively unexpected low intensity input. If you look at the actual spike traces that simulated this off of a popular model of mismatch negativity, a weak unexpected input produces regular spiking at 12 spikes per second. And if you switch the input to strong, it jumps up to 21. But if you then make it expected, it drops right back down to 12, which means if you are another part of the brain and all you are seeing is the spiking output of this comparator, you have no way of knowing whether it was a weak or a strong input. There are ways around this. You can use a copy of the expectations to try to undo that inhibition later on. Or, as many people have proposed in their models, you can effectively make a separate system. You have your feature detection where your brain is pulling out all of the different features of the world around you. And those are used to create predictions, but the predictions are compared in a completely separate system for each feature detector, producing only match or mismatch as an output. So nothing needs to be able to interpret anything else about the stimulus from this output. The thing that has always rubbed me a little bit the wrong way about this, though, is it requires you to literally kind of copy over a system for every feature detector you have in the brain. And while you may be able to make it slightly more efficient than this, kind of at first approximation, that doubles the size of your brain. Using a whole lot of comparator systems that very often will not be active. And that just seems very redundant and not terribly metabolically efficient. So if we want to build an alternate comparator, we want something that can modify its firing in order to signal whether or not something was expected, because that's how it can communicate to the rest of the brain. But we also would like something that, at the same time, without that kind of extra redundancy, can convey accurate information about the stimulus. This means that the coding system that we use is going to have to change. Because if you're modifying your code but conveying the same information, you need to change your encoding somehow or another, at least a little. To put it simply, our neurons have to learn how to code switch, depending on their context. So then we started considering what codes to use. So everyone here is in Boston, at least for the day, so this is an appropriate metaphor. You've heard about Paul Revere and this church where some lanterns were hung. And everyone focuses on the content of the communication with the lanterns. The 1 equals land, 2 equals sea. But most of the information that was being communicated had been prearranged and assigned to the channel through which it was being communicated. The fact that there was any signal from the Old North Church on a given night meant that the British regulars were advancing on Lexington and Concord. And that's actually a lot more information than just land or sea. The way this could be communicated so effectively, especially before Morse code was invented, was by prearranging what that signal meant. You can trigger effectively an arbitrarily large amount of information with basically 1 byte of communicated information if you have prearranged that signal. I can hand you an encyclopedia and tell you, if you see a light in my window tomorrow night, this encyclopedia is correct. And if you see the light, you will have gained an enormous amount of knowledge from that 1 light turning on. This is very efficient, but you cannot actually prearrange a channel for all possible outcomes. If you started trying to arrange steeples around Boston for the French are coming, or the Belgians are retreating southward, or things like that, you would run out of church steeples even in this town. And the problem is, if you don't have a prearranged channel for this, it fails pretty much entirely. If, for instance, the French had showed up, the American revolutionaries would have had no recourse other than writing out a letter by hand and sending someone off on a horse. They had no prearranged way of communicating that. So it struck me that what we would like here is when things are going as predicted, we can communicate through church steeples. We can have prearranged signals, and that can communicate very quickly and very efficiently with a very minimal code. However, when they do not go as predicted, we need to fall back on a more general code that relies on the content of the message. In the case of Paul Revere, it was, we didn't know if it was going to be land or sea. We knew they were probably going to be advancing on Lexington, but we didn't know how. And so that was left to the content and not the channel of communication. Realistically, now that we live after the invention of Morse code, it would probably be something closer to that. But to translate this back to a neural context, what we're talking about is something called labeled line encoding that was proposed around 1830. And it's widely accepted and used in the peripheral nervous system. Think about receiving touch on one finger. The content being carried along those axons, the spike patterns, will tell you about the amount of pressure. But the location of the touch, the fact that it's on your finger and not your toe, is determined, prearranged basically by the channel of communication that's being used. Which axons going to the brain are actually carrying this signal about the intensity. It is not terribly common to find labeled line encoding proposed as a general mechanism for the forebrain, because historically it's been assumed that it's very, very difficult to label a line for every possible percept that the brain might be handling, every cognitive state, all of that. But given that we're talking about using steeples only when we have good predictions, since we're talking about how to process expectations anyway, our expectations are based on our strong predictions. So we can prearrange these labeled lines, and if we can dynamically create a labeled line encoding system, then we can use labeled lines for the outcomes that we are expecting with confidence. And if we lack a confident prediction, or if something just goes horribly wrong, at which point we will very quickly begin to lack a confident prediction, we can fall back on something like rate-based encoding, which is a more general content-oriented encoding scheme that can encode a continuum of information rather than just a single prearranged packet of arbitrary size. And so this whole thing is what I have called dynamically labeled predictive coding, and that the predictive coding is dynamically generated in the form of labeled lines. And compared to the previous example, our sensory input causes something to spike very many times. Memory and prediction mechanisms go to work, and then some kind of mechanism here is going to switch us to like just a bit of information. You just need one little spike or like one little burst to communicate, yes, everything that you predicted, proceed as though it just happened. So the next question is, how do we code switch? And the answer is by modifying properties that have historically been assumed to be intrinsic. So we've classified neurons for a long while based on their firing patterns, based on whether they oscillate, whether they resonate, whether they integrate, whether they burst or regular spike. But an increasing number of studies are showing that these properties, which are very stable very often in slice work or anesthetized animals, when you're looking at an actual awake behaving animal, these properties are very dynamic. They can change for an individual neuron depending on the context. And the general proposal is that they are determined by, in large part, the incoming synaptic activity from other areas, which is largely suppressed in anesthetized animals and removed entirely in vitro slice work. So for anyone in the room who is less familiar with neurons, their electrical activity is mediated not by a flow of electrons, the way like most of our electrical appliances run, by a flow of ions, where you move like an atom that has an incorrect number of electrons, and for instance, a positive charge from the nucleus of that atom can allow you to accumulate voltage and charge very effectively. And so if this is the edge of the cell of a neuron, and there are these channels through it that can open and close and allow different ions through. And so we ended up focusing very particularly on one channel. It's called the KCQ channel, and it carries something called the M current, which is a flow of potassium ions when it is open. This is an outward potassium current, and potassium ions are positive, so when they flow out, it depolarizes the voltage of the neuron. It moves it negatively. It is non-inactivating, which means it doesn't get plugged up by anything else. It has to open, and then it has to close the same way it opened. Nothing blocks it rapidly. Acetylcholine turns it off, which will become relevant later on. But the most important thing for our purposes is that the time constant on it is voltage dependent, which means it opens more rapidly if there's already a large voltage differential across the cell membrane. And it closes more rapidly at a large voltage differential, except because the opening and closing is also voltage dependent. If you're at a high voltage, you're probably opening. But this means that, for instance, if there's a spike in the cell voltage, it can open quite rapidly at the peak of the spike. But in the refractory period following that, where the voltage is very low again, the channels will not close quite as rapidly as they were opening, which allows you to kind of carry over some activation from spike to spike. Now, this is most often used because of that in models as a kind of rate limiting current. But Prescott and colleagues, including Sichnowski, showed that under a dynamic clamp, if you set up the right interaction between the chloride leak currents and the M current, it can kind of open everything in advance. And at that point, you get this very nice switch in, for instance, firing probability from a kind of continuous like shift in probability as current is injected in increasing amounts. It is basically a step function where you have a much less probabilistic response, very reliable, and it goes straight from not firing at all to firing. And in particular, once that firing happens, they found that the M current is able to clamp down on following spikes because it has been kind of pre-activated in this way. This is basically our code switching. We have a mechanism for taking neurons and switching them between continuous rate-based encoding and a single burst to indicate like that expectations are being met. So that is going to kind of conclude the framework for looking at this. Key features to keep in mind is like the code switching, the comparison, which can happen because of this in a single neuron without relying on like larger scale circuitry. And in particular that you get reduced activity in response to the expected inputs. But if you imagine that downstream neurons are similarly code switched so that they are ready to respond with a single burst upon input, you can actually get faster downstream processing. You no longer have to integrate a large rate-based signal. Everything can just transmit the one bit of information as quickly as possible downstream. So to try to apply this framework, we went and built a model of mismatch in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a very old part of your cortex, been associated with context-dependent sequence recall and predictions, so things like episodic memory and spatial navigation. And there's a large body of evidence showing that area CA1 acts as an associative mismatch detector. To touch briefly, as I said, really, on the generation of the predictions, CA3 and the dentate gyrus, Listman has done a very nice series of models on how this kind of interaction between associative networks and auto-associative networks can produce a robust sequence recall that can then be continued out into the future to generate predictions. So to look at the kind of circuitry within which we're trying to situate our model, we have the dentate and the CA3 doing their thing, generating predictions which come out through Schaefer collaterals to CA1. And the entorhinal cortex is transmitting processed sensory input through also to CA1, more apically. So CA1 as a comparator seems to be performing this comparison between the predictions and the input, exactly like we were talking about in the framework. It demonstrates greater activity when there's a mismatch between these. And this has also been found not just in fMRI, but in electrophysiological recordings. Nova in 2001 showed that if in an awake animal, if you repeatedly expose the same stimulus, CA1 pyramidal cells habituate, but they habituate, if you'll notice, in a very particular way, where they go from continuous spiking in response to the stimulus to just a few spikes at the onset. However, if you remove, or in this case transect, the Schaefer collaterals, which is effectively cutting off access to the predictions, then habituation just entirely stops. So this is not habituation of the CA1 neurons on their own. This is habituation that is being created by input from the Schaefer collaterals. So there are no thorough computational models of CA1 comparison so far. CATS has modeled CA1 activity, but that was coming from a spatial navigation perspective, where the confluence of these two streams on CA1 neurons was viewed as a coincidence detection between place and context. It's entirely possible that the exact same model and mechanism will work as a mismatch detector, but it's difficult to draw conclusions from a model that was approaching it from such a different set of assumptions and context. And Listman, as I mentioned, has a very nice set of models based on Socratic that focus largely on CA3 dentate gyrus, and they talk about CA1's role as a comparator, but as far as I've been able to find, no one has actually computationally implemented that part yet. So we set out to build our own. Very simple. Like I said, single cell can do this. So we used a point neuron, model the CA1 pyramidal cell, and stuck it with 200 excitatory priming synapses, 200 inhibitory priming synapses, in the hope that like the inhibition and the chloride current that results can hold the membrane potential at a place where the M current can sufficiently activate in order to switch from regular spiking to this like onset burst when the 200 stronger sensory driving synapses begin to transmit sensory input. So there's a bit of math coming up. I'll try to keep it brief. So we represent the neuron using basically a Morris-Laclar model with a few extra ion channels. It basically does the change in your membrane voltage is just going to be the summation of the amount of currents from different ion channels, taking into account capacitance. And each current is represented in the form of like a maximum conductance, proportion of maximum conductance that is currently available due to channels being open or closed, and the driving force of the difference in voltages between the current membrane voltage and the equilibrium voltage, where all of the ions have settled out and there's no electrical charge pushing them across anymore. The only one I'm going to get into any detail on is the M current, because this is an important one. There's basically two terms here. There's the dynamic term, which is the proportion of channels that is open. And two things to take away from this, if you're not like overly fluent in reading differential equations. This is the rate of change in the number of channels that are open. And it is based on voltage. And it is divided by something called tau z, which is the time constant. And the time constant here is not dynamic. It's not a rate of change. This is actually just what the time constant is at any given moment. And out of its maximum possible, it is going to be a proportion which is also based on voltage. And so that's how we get the phenomenon that I was talking about earlier with the voltage-dependent time constant. So our input synapses, I just press on processes. Random kind of sparse spike generation coming down each one of these synapses. When a spike did hit the synapse, they were modeled as according to Bruno and Wang, which is 3 synaptic currents, although not 3 on any given synapse. There are 2 for excitatory synapses, glutamate and the NMDA, and 1 for inhibitory, which is GABA. So I'm going to go to investigation and results. We did do more investigations on the hippocampal model, but most of them were repeated later on in the neocortical model with almost exactly the same results. So I'm just going to show you a little bit on this one. So the purpose of the primary investigation was just to see, like, Prescott managed to show that this could shift with dynamic hash clamping if you were directly controlling things and injecting current. Could synaptic input actually cause this to happen in a realistic in vivo situation? Can priming synaptic input basically trigger this code switch where if the priming input is turned off and you just have the sensory driving input, you get the repeated fire, but if the priming input is on, you just get confirmation of expectations. So the raster plot of the input spikes for primed input. And I'll try to keep these little icons available to like let you know that something is primed or unprimed. You can keep an eye out for like the presence of the red and blue there. But for the primed input, we start the priming a little bit in advance, the occurrence some time to like open up, and then the driving input gets with much higher weight. In our simulations, the priming input generally stayed on until the end of the driving input, but that is not actually necessary. The mode switch can be accomplished just by leaving it on a little bit after the onset. For the unprimed simulations, it's the same thing, just without any of the priming input. And the results we got. Primed, we got a very nice single burst of spikes. For unprimed, we got continuous spiking. And when we looked at the activation of the M current, we found that basically what's going on here, while it swings wildly while it's continuously spiking, you can kind of trace a sort of plateau that it reaches. And you can see the blue current, which represents the primed condition here, also reaches a plateau, but it reaches a plateau of a greater magnitude. Because this is an inhibitory current, plateauing at that higher magnitude is what allows it, after it reaches the plateau, which takes a couple spikes, to clamp down on the spiking and leave you depolarized, but not firing. So just kind of review that. We've, at this point, successfully included a model within this like dynamically labeled predictive coding framework. We've matched some recorded spiking data from Benvenuto, and we've demonstrated a biological mechanism by which this code switching can occur and be driven by anticipatory inputs. So the next question we asked was, could this mechanism apply outside of the hippocampus? And it turns out all of the necessary ion channels exist in neocortical pyramidal cells. So we looked at that. There are many different markers of mismatch in the neocortex. You have the mismatch negativity, kind of a low-level sensory one, and the one that we ended up looking at. But there's the early right anterior negativity, or the left anterior negativity, which is for more complicated syntactic mismatches in music and language. Error-related negativities, which is when you realize that you've made a mistake, answered something incorrectly. But those others are a little bit more complicated. And honestly, there's been less laboratory work done examining them. And so we focus on the mismatch negativity. This is very similar to what I was talking about at the beginning, where if I'm dealing out cards in ascending order, or doing anything else where there's an obvious pattern, and I just keep that up for a while, and then break the pattern, you will have started to expect that the pattern continues. It's almost impossible not to. And the things that continue the pattern are called standards in this kind of experimental paradigm, and the things that break the pattern are called oddballs. And it could be just repeating one thing over and over again like the green squares, or it could be ascending numbers. And you can break the pattern in multiple ways. Like it can stop ascending and it can stop being a number. When you do this and record with EEG or MEG, you get a number of responses, and the signal to noise is not very good, so you have to average a great many responses. But you can average the brain's electrical response to oddballs and average the electrical response to standards, and you take the difference of the two, and that's the mismatch negativity, that negative deflection. So it's important to remember a little bit for later on that it's not actually like a particular a direct response, it is a difference in responses. And so in order to really check a model of it, we have to simulate two different conditions, the standard and the oddball, and then look at the difference. So there are some different hypotheses regarding how mismatch negativity is generated. Predictive coding, very similar to what I've been talking about, where you have something that generates expectations. Sensory-specific adaptation, on the other hand, is a very bottom-up kind of view where it's known that neurons respond less to repeated inputs that just keep driving them over and over again in the neocortex. And they're proposing that this afferent habituation is sufficient to explain the mismatch negativity on its own. And you don't even need predictions. They each have some benefits and drawbacks. The top-down and memory-based model historically has suffered from that kind of duplication issue that I mentioned before. And it can be a little bit complicated. And the sensory-specific adaptation is fairly simple. It's just when you give somebody a new stimulus, you're hitting fresh neurons. And so they're going to respond more strongly. And when you take the difference, you'll see a difference between those two. So we ended up taking an approach that kind of merged these two, where if you'll remember in the hippocampus, talking about how there was observed habituation in CA1, but the habituation was not intrinsic to those neurons. It was, in part at least, stimulated by predictions that were coming in. So if we can habituate neurons like this, then we don't need that duplication. But if the habituations can be driven by predictions, then it can still actually function in a cognitive framework that involves expectations. Because regardless of whether or not expectations are needed for a given model, I feel like I'm on reasonably safe ground assuming that we can all agree that humans have expectations and that we use them for something. So adapting our hippocampal model to the neocortex, it actually works out kind of nicely. From a mismatch negativity paradigm, if I'm showing you repeated blue squares, initially you will be encoding them because you have no strong expectation using spike rates. As this repeats, eventually you start priming your visual sensory areas and you encode the last blue square you saw with just a single spike because you know you were expecting another blue square. Then when a red square hits, it's going to be hitting non-primed neurons in your visual cortex because you've been priming neurons that are responding to blue. And the unprimed neurons will not have code switch and will therefore respond to the driving input with a long train of spikes, once again, which will be sufficient to indicate to other systems, for example, attentional orienting systems, that something unexpected has just occurred, and maybe you should pay attention to it. And because the neocortex has so many areas compared to just CA1, one might even be able to imagine chaining this out. So that the next area up from whatever sensory area we're looking at could itself be primed. So whatever abstract representation is happening there could be primed such that even if the lower level is slightly different, as long as the abstraction at the higher level continues to match, it could respond with just one spike. And when the low level is responding with just one spike, the upper level could then pass that spike along very easily. The one other thing we need if we're simulating EEG effectively is electrical fields. Because we're not in EEG measuring the spiking of the neurons, which is what we've been looking at. We're not measuring exactly the voltage. We're measuring the dipole moment of the quasi-static electric fields that are generated by the pyramidal cells perpendicular to the scalp. So the dipole is actually part of an expansion of kind of a mathematical model of how a complex cell generates electrical fields due to its electrical activity. The series expansion basically starts by saying, well, let's see how much we can explain with a single point of current. And then looking at how much can be explained with if you add 2 points of current and then add 3 and 4. The dipole moment is the one with 2 current points, a source and a sink. And if you have a source and a sink, you will get these current flows between them, which are the solid lines here. And the dotted lines are the electric fields from perpendicular to those. Luckily for us, the dipole moment is basically the only thing that you can still pick up with electrodes at a distance like that of the scalp to the brain. Most of the others fall off very rapidly. So we can go ahead and model our fields using just a dipole. And the simplest model that can generate a dipole field is 2 points. So we take 2 point neurons, and Roll in 1962 was kind enough to do a demonstration that in the dipole, one of the points corresponds to the apical half of the pyramidal cell, and one of them corresponds to the basal half. So we just assign our 2 point neurons like that. And then in order to keep them from just being 2 separate neurons, simplest way to kind of keep them connected is just to bridge them with a resistor. So this gives us 2 types of currents happening. There's transmembrane currents, which are what's been going on in the model so far, all of the ones in the Morris-Lacquard. And then there's now an axial current, which means that if the voltage is different between these 2, it can, over time, equilibrate without having to involve ion flow in or out of the cell. That gives us a new model architecture for the neocortex, which is very similar to the old one. It's slightly more Art Deco, but otherwise. And it corresponds very nicely to a layer 2-3 pyramidal neuron. Same 600 synapses, except now the excitation is happening apically. If you think about, for instance, cortico-cortical connections arriving in upper layer 2 or layer 1 of a cortical region and synapsing on to layer 2-3 pyramidal neurons. Those would be in a very good position to drive both the apical excitation and interneurons, which would then also provide priming inhibition. So now we have that model, we look at the current flow between the points. And if we look specifically at the transmembrane currents, not the axial current between them, that allows us to generate the electric field, which is a function of the difference in transmembrane currents. Luckily, it's rotational symmetrical, which makes it a lot simpler. You just need one angle and a radius. And you can get this very nice field. So if, for instance, priming is happening, but no driving is going on, you have a source in the apical section, and the basal section is functioning as the same, which means you would have a positive electrical field in this direction and a negative one towards the base. And given that the apical dendrites are in EEG, at least the ones we can measure, are pointing towards the scalp, we would expect a positive deflection in the EEG electrodes. And once the driving comes in, because, as I mentioned, these are much stronger synapses, they will switch the source in sync, and you'll get a negative deflection on the scalp electrode. This may seem a little esoteric, but it actually turns out to be important in a bit. So now that we have built that model, we basically applied all the same Morris-Lacquard style modeling to this new dipole model. We used the same primed and unprimed kind of input patterns and ran basically the same investigation as before. And in the unprimed, we got very nice, rapid spiking. In the primed, we got an onset response. Electric fields, we got a negative deflection. In the primed, you can see the priming effect, followed by a little bit of a deflection. And when you subtract this from this, the difference shows you a very nice negative deflection where you would expect a mismatch negativity. So that was pretty exciting. But it gets better. Because if you recall, we talked about like the positive deflection that priming causes. Turns out, this guy Baldwin had found this in EEG. If you start looking at just the standards rather than the difference, you find what he calls a repetition positivity. And it grows with the number of repetitions, or as he speculates, the strength of the expectations, which should correspond to how many repetitions of like a green square you have sat through. So the dashed line is at 6 repetitions, and the solid line is at 36, and you can see it growing. I should point out this is a slightly older convention for plotting. It looks like it's moving. It is plotted moving downward, but that actually represents a positive deflection here, because in ERP studies, there's a convention that's starting to fall by the wayside, but some people still use of plotting negative up. So we tried this out, modified the strength of the expectations, and looked at some standard runs where there was just priming and drive, nothing unprimed. And we produced a repetition positivity, which, as you increase the strength of the expectational priming, increases in amplitude, just as was found in humans. So third thing we looked at was confusability. If you remember before, the subtractive comparators had this problem where it was difficult to tell like which was which. Our comparator reacts very differently. It is pretty nonlinear. Before it switches over and does that code switch into just onset spiking, it remains very easy to differentiate between three different intensities of input. After the switch, it's very difficult to differentiate, except you don't need to differentiate based on the content of the message at that point. Because when we switch, we have prearranged that the information will be conveyed just by the channel. So basically, all the way along the graph, you have a reliable ability to differentiate different intensities without needing complicated circuitry to undo this comparison. To look at the spikes, this is the one that I showed at the beginning of the talk. And this one, you can differentiate weak and strong very easily, as long as they're unexpected. But for expected, it's going to be exactly the same, except you already know whether it's weak or strong, because you had an expectation about whether it would be weak or strong, and you know, based on this input, that your expectation was correct. To kind of homunculize the downstream neurons a little bit. Last investigation on the neocortical model, the one that excited me the most, it occurred to us we have a biologically realistic model, one of the more biologically realistic models, actually. A lot of these rate-based modeling or very simple, like Zikovich neurons. So we decided to do some pharmacological manipulation on the ion channels. It's well known that NMDA blockade reduces or abolishes the mismatch negativity. So we tried that, simulating basically syncytinate or PCP, which is an NMDA blocker. And we simulated an activity decrease in KCNQ, which you could get with, for instance, a cholinesterase inhibitor like rivastigmine. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And we simulated an activity increase in the KCNQ channels, as is found with vertigamine, which is a KCNQ agonist. And then we realized, I was looking at this one day, and I realized PCP is one of those common animal models for schizophrenia, and vertigamine is an antipsychotic, which has had some efficacy in treating certain forms of schizophrenia. So we combined the two. We simulated NMDA blockade and then KCNQ activity increase to see if it would actually give us any insight. So for the NMDA blockade, for all of these, without knowing exactly dosages and proportions and things like that, it's difficult to figure out what percentage of channels were blocked. So I went with a very simple 25% increase or decrease in everything on the assumption that would give an idea of at least the direction we were moving in. So with simulated PCP, code switching was impaired. It kind of stutters, but continues to spike as it goes along. And the subtraction reveals a decreased, although not abolished, mismatch negativity. I suspect that if we went further than 25%, you would see these two look exactly equal and a pretty much complete abolition of mismatch negativity. Because that abolition has been found to be dose dependent in humans. The next one got a bit more interesting. So for the conductance decrease, as with the cholinesterase inhibitor, it showed exactly the same spiking outputs, but very different electrical fields. In fact, the mismatch negativity remained unchanged. very strange for two reasons. One, as far as I know, there has been no model to date that proposes that the mismatch negativity can be decoupled from the underlying mismatch process. That you can have a mismatch negativity with no difference in the actual spiking output. The MMN is often used as an index of mismatch detection to determine just noticeable differences, for instance. And this, while it certainly seems to largely still be reliable, would indicate that under certain circumstances, you can actually dissociate those two. The reason this is possible, if you'll remember back to the electric field section, is that the electric fields are generated based on the relative differences in transmembrane currents between the apex and the base. Whereas the spiking output is generated by the membrane depolarization just at the base. So what's going on at the apex, while it will have some impact on the membrane voltage at the base, can have a much stronger impact on the electrical fields, to the point that you can actually switch the electrical field or preserve a mismatch negativity without a difference in spiking. Klingenberg also conveniently, and there were a few other similar studies, found that erdafitinib had no impact on the mismatch negativity. In fact, the only studies that have found an impact on mismatch negativity with cholinesterase inhibitors are studies on patients with severe, actually, Alzheimer's disease. And I don't know enough to speculate about exactly what's happening there. So we then did the opposite, increased casing and Q conductance, upping the M current. And as you might expect, since it's the M current that is largely responsible for this code switch, what that did is it forced the code switch in all circumstances, even without priming. So you get the same priming. Everything is expected now. And the mismatch negativity basically vanishes. So in this case, it does correspond to the lack of difference. As far as we've been able to find, there are no mismatch negativity studies on casing Q agonists like Vertigrin. But this provides a very nice prediction if anyone would like to do one. So finally, for the antipsychotic test, jumping back to the PCP administration, as these two become more similar and everything becomes effectively encoded as unexpected, if you'll indulge me a little bit of kind of broad metaphorical thinking, to the extent that I am incapable of distinguishing between experiences that match my expectations and experiences that don't, that is a possible basis for at least contributing to, for instance, delusions. And if everything is triggering an attentional orienting response, as though it was a mismatch, that could go a reasonable way towards explaining, for instance, some of the cognitive deficits associated with schizophrenia, particularly working memory deficits, where it's been established, actually, in part by some people in this room, that a lot of working memory is based on your ability to ignore things that you don't want to hold in working memory. So given that to whatever extent you're comfortable using that as a model of schizophrenia, we then added the extra casing Q conductance, particularly on top of it. And we got a reasonably good switch back to just onset spiking. So we were able to kind of restore at least some of the processing ability to distinguish between like a phasic response and a tonic response. However, there was no restoration of the mismatch negativity, which provides one of my favorite predictions coming out of this. And no one has tested this, as far as I know. Vertigrin treatment in schizophrenia, even in patients who are responding well to it, where it is actually alleviating some of the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia, it should not rescue the mismatch negativity. So to kind of close off discussion of this, I wanted to acknowledge similarities between this neocortical model and another model of the mismatch negativity that came out of this department in the 80s. That was based on adaptive resonance theory by Steve Grossberg. It's very similar about predictions and top-down, bottom-up comparisons. They both feature kind of reset mechanisms with mismatch. And there's a goodness of fit threshold in that it doesn't find just whatever matches the best. It specifically does not signal a match unless something matches closely enough. But there's a very big difference, which is in adaptive resonance theory, it is based on resonance, which increases the activity. And so matches there involve heavily increased activity, whereas in my model, it works the opposite way, and a match involves a drastic reduction in activity. So, kind of summarize that section, we've successfully transitioned to the neocortex. We've matched the EEG data and made a couple predictions, which hopefully can be checked in experiments in the years to come. So, the last little section, modeling alpha and attention. It may seem to come out of left field, but it does tie back in. So you can suppress information or the transfer of information around your brain basically through alpha oscillations, is this hypothesis. And it's been found in correlative experiments where they showed that when you were ignoring, for instance, a visual input, you will get strong alpha power over your visual cortex. If you're ignoring one visual hemisphere, you will get strong alpha power over the corresponding cortical. But it's also been demonstrated in more causal experiments by Romay and colleagues, where they use transcranial magnetic stimulation to induce alpha oscillations over visual cortex. And they induced them at different frequencies. And then gave subjects a target detection task, where they just had to catch targets as they were flashing on the screen, react to targets. And turns out everything was kind of like not statistically different or significantly different at 5 hertz or 20 hertz, but at 10 hertz, the smack center of the alpha band, that frequency of induced oscillation could actually cause people to miss targets. Or if it was over the other hemisphere, it could assist them greatly in noticing targets in the presence of distractors. So there's a lot of experimental work on this, but they're not, once again, computational models. The most commonly discussed mechanism is pulsed inhibition, which is just the idea of like there's inhibitory cells that shut everything down on a regular basis, and that would disrupt communication. And this explains one other finding about it, which is that it seems to be phase dependent. There are moments during the alpha oscillation where you can get information through better, and moments where it's worse. And so if it was pulsed inhibition, do that. However, Paul and Abschool and I at Grandes thought of an alternate explanation, which does involve pulsed inhibition, but also involves resonance in the thalamocortical circuit that is generating the alpha oscillations. Resonance has been observed in whole system like EEG and electric field studies, and also observed in single cell recordings. They respond more strongly when the inputs are coming at around 10 times per second in hertz. So we built a simple rate-based system. This is not nearly as biologically detailed as the previous one, but it does contain T-currents in the thalamic relay cells, which are a particular type of thalamic current that is thought to be involved in the generation of alpha. And is very excitatory, but in order to be activated, requires strong inhibition first, that like hyperpolarizes you beyond your resting state, that like moves you even more negative than your normal resting voltage. We also included gap junctions in the reticular nucleus cells, which turn out to be vital for synchronizing oscillations across a population of this. And a gap junction is basically just a hole that bridges two neurons. It's a non-synaptic way for them to effectively communicate voltage changes. And so the thalamus can then, with pulses of inhibition and activation of the gap junctions, begin to oscillate and in turn drive the neocortex, which here is represented by just a population of excitatory and a population of inhibitory cells. Then we got Dan involved and started talking about how this might be controlled. And so we looked at the basal ganglia and possible mechanisms in the cortex to control the initiation of alpha if you wanted to actually ignore something, because you have to be able to consciously start this process if you're going to intentionally ignore something. So before learning about a stimulus and deciding to try to ignore it, you have a release of acetylcholine in the thalamus, which in part shuts down those gap junctions, which helps prevent organized oscillations from forming. And you also have drastically reduced inhibition from the lobus pallidus to the thalamocortical relay neurons. And so you end up with desynchronized, non-oscillatory behavior. However, through the indirect pathway, the neocortex can effectively stimulate the lobus pallidus, causing a burst of inhibition, and simultaneously reduce the acetylcholine, allowing the formation of these synchronized oscillations, which then can begin to drive a thalamocortical oscillatory loop at a given frequency, depending on the inputs and the strength of the inhibition. So we tuned our model and to be resonant at 10 hertz, as the experimental findings showed, and basically set it up so that it could oscillate in alpha and in the band right below alpha, theta, which is not associated with intentional ignoring. And if you recall in the Berteau et al. Paper, did not significantly impact detection of targets. And we investigated that using mutual information, which is basically a measure of the extent to which an input signal, in this case like a noisy input signal, can be predicted by the output signal. I'm short on time. Speed up a bit. Above and beyond your ability to predict something from itself. So it's basically looking at like how much of this has come through. And when it's in alpha, the neocortex very quickly falls into a saturated state where it is just kind of slamming back and forth between firing as fast as it can and being drastically inhibited. And when you're firing as fast as you can, or when you're completely inhibited as a neuron, you do not respond very much to more subtle changes in input. So there's very little response as the noise varies. However, in theta, because of the lack of resonance, the neocortex is not driven to saturation. And as a result, it's capable of responding much more effectively in a way that traces out the levels of the input noise. And when we ran mutual information measures on these, we found a very significant difference in that theta at 6 hertz had more than twice the mutual information. There was more than a 50% drop off when you moved from theta into alpha, showing that this was in fact not just a mechanism for destroying information, but a frequency dependent one. We then looked at phase response in the model, found that if you sent an impulse in rather than continuous noise, the response in terms of this output spike rate was in fact very heavily phase dependent. As you move to lighter and lighter gray, that's a different phase at which we sent the impulse in. And then we attempted to recreate an experiment by Bush and colleagues wherein they showed that in a detection task, your hits ratio normalized was in fact also phase dependent, depending on the phase of alpha that happened to be ongoing when the target appeared in front of you. So we simulated that same task using just a kind of threshold classifier thing. If we got enough change, we could detect a target. If we didn't, we didn't. And we found a very similar kind of plot where our target detection, our hits rate was significantly higher at a particular phase. And when you moved off of that aligned phase, it got a lot worse. However, there are a couple limitations to this approach. There are some things that indicate that alpha might not actually be completely saturating the firing rate of the neocortex. Aside from being a little bit inefficient and possibly causing toxicity, Huggins and colleagues observed that cortical neurons in premotor in macaque monkeys fire at a reduced average rate during alpha oscillations. Now, this was an attending to target task, so this was not intentional ignoring. But when they had higher alpha oscillations, they tended to miss the target more. And those higher alpha oscillations were associated with a reduced firing rate. What they also found was that the neurons oscillating alpha fired the most at the least depolarized, which is particularly counterintuitive. Usually, the closer a neuron is to being past its threshold, the easier it is to get it to fire a lot. However, if you remember, we were dealing with a bunch of neurons earlier under the dynamic label predictive coding framework that when code switching held a very depolarized state, and when driven to fire, would fire only once or twice, rather than a great many times, because the depolarized state allowed the IM current to activate forward. So to kind of tie it back together, we started thinking about ignoring as predicting. In a predictive coding kind of framework, as put forward by Tristan, where you're basically propagating error signals up and trying to explain away inputs with predictions, the best way to keep something from propagating through your brain is to expect it. And that works fine if you can predict exactly what's happening, but if you don't know what's going to happen, but you just know you need to ignore everything that annoying person is yelling in your ear while you're like looking for your glasses or something like that, you can basically think of alpha oscillations as a kind of cyclic way of priming a large area of the brain for expecting everything. Whatever comes in, if it comes in during the upshot of those oscillations, it's going to be treated as though it was expected, which in turn also prevents the attentional orienting response. So we worked on a preliminary model. Luckily, our layer 2-3 neuron fit very nicely into this little subset of Stephanie Jones's model of alpha generation, where we have our apical excitation, which in her model comes from nonspecific thalamic neurons. We have basal inhibition, which comes from the layer 2-3 interneurons. And sensory input comes from thalamus by layer 4. This is basically the same neuron that we were looking at in the neocortical mismatch, but now the priming is being driven not from top-down expectations from other cortical areas, but via the indirect pathway and the basal ganglia being driven from the thalamus in kind of a broadly oscillatory fashion. So we still have the Poisson processes, the non-specific priming inputs. We, instead of just turning the spikes on and off, we modulated the spike rate in just a very simple sine wave at like an alpha frequency. And sensory input remained the kind of thing that we just turn on and off at the moment of sensory input. And then we varied the phase of sensory onset relative to the priming alpha oscillations. And this is just one preliminary result, but it's fairly promising in that when you were at the most depolarized and the priming is at the least, you will get the most spiking if a sensory stimulus arrives at that moment. Whereas if the phase is a little bit later and you are on like the kind of upper portion of the alpha oscillation, just that bit of a switch in depolarization allows the imcurrent to have activated enough that you get code switching once again, and you're treating it under the framework as though it was expected. If this is sufficient to drive an attentional orienting response, for instance, it has like a threshold that doesn't get primed, and this is not sufficient to integrate past that threshold, that would mean that alpha prevents you from attentionally orienting to the onset of new stimuli. So it could be just suppression of attentional orienting, but it could also, if you think back to when I was talking about the cortex, chaining several layers of this together in terms of priming and passing that one spike along. If alpha is priming all of your basic sensory area to expect everything, but none of your more abstract areas are expecting anything in particular, they will not be primed, not be depolarized, and will therefore not pass spiking threshold if they're hit by just one or two spikes. So the result here in an alpha primed sensory cortex could actually just die out before it propagates upwards. So really quickly, I'll run through future directions. I'm interested in applying the star. One of my favorite quotes about it: the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to preserve that novelty response. So looking at music, because that's statistically the easiest to deal with, there are many types of enjoyable musical surprise, and a lot of them habituate rapidly. Like if somebody records themselves singing and then speeds up the record so it sounds like chipmunks. A lot of people found that really enjoyable the first time they heard it. But there are some musical techniques that resist this habituation, where you can find a song that you enjoy, not for associative reasons necessarily, but like it actually directly elicits some kind of enjoyment. And you can listen to it every week your entire adult life and still enjoy it. And that suggests that it's possible to sort of shut down this habituative response and basically sustain the novelty response. An example of how I think this is done comes from garden path sentences, where you build up expectations, and then there's an associative mismatch. And there's a recontextualization that kind of resolves it. Like in the sentence, the old man, the boats. Where when you hear the old man, you normally think of man as the noun, the subject, but it's actually the old. And the old are who are manning the boats. And it takes kind of a recontextualization, a reconsideration, in order for that to make sense after the fact. With music, as I said, there's a lot of statistics available. So there's an essence corpus of German folk songs. They're not exactly perfect for modern music, but they're Western, they're tonal, and they are analyzed to death. So using those, I was able to make a anyway, you will have to imagine it. I was able to put together a brief little melody that first established itself in a flat major, builds expectations that it's about to resolve to the tonic in a very trite and predictable way, then drops down to an E natural, which is statistically unheard of in the essence corpus, and then builds a chord, which lets you realize that you've actually been in the corresponding F minor this entire time. And then resolves to the tonic in F minor. And I will skip the relevant, mostly just to show that like these things all have representations in the brain. But what I was really interested in is striatal reward prediction and the ability of the striatum to basically cancel out expected rewards, at least as far as a very dopamine chauvinistic first pass at this kind of thing would go. And this is known as habituation of reinforcer effectiveness. And if you consider pattern recognition and successful prediction to be kind of an intrinsic reinforcer, then the more confident you are in your pattern recognition, the more trite something sounds to you, the less rewarding it's going to be. It will habituate. The novelty will go away. But if you trick the striatum into predicting that there will not be reward, that opens up a window of opportunity, which allows you the opportunity to elicit a strong dopamine release by giving it pattern recognition when it wasn't expecting any. And nothing really is going to trick it into thinking no reward is forthcoming better than realizing that you have just gotten all of your predictions completely wrong. In life, most of the time, that is not followed by a drastically rewarding experience. So I proposed a very simple kind of like almost artificial neural network. We have areas that represent like pitch chroma, key, use that to determine scale degree within a key. Makes predictions, detects mismatch. We have a single neuron representing the striatum, which inhibits the single VTA neuron. And like, it'll respond to the recognition of a key and scale degrees with a bit of dopamine at the beginning of a song, but that quickly habituates. The striatum cancels it out. Until you get this mismatch. And the mismatch ends up turning off the striatum, and you now also have no idea what key you're in. But that's when building up that chord in the corresponding line key lets you realize you're in F minor, begin recognizing things, making predictions, and having them borne out again, and allows dopamine release. So as long as you can keep fooling people enough to get that mismatch, as long as like the global statistics that is based on are enough to trick you, you could reliably keep producing this dopamine reward. Basically, what I'm hoping to explore that model in the future is the ability of artists to build up expectations based on their audience's particular past, disrupt the striatal inhibition through surprise, and then follow that surprise with a resolution, a recontextualization that delivers reward when your brain wasn't looking for it. So in conclusion to the entire thing, main points I would hope you take away are that this framework offers code switching that allows comparison at the level of individual neurons, and code switching at the level of individual neurons, dynamic shifts in coding throughout the cortex, at least. You can represent the expected and unexpected information differently, and it's very efficient in terms of both spikes and downstream processing to like when your predictions are accurate. And we've produced some promising preliminary models that have some interesting predictions coming out of them. And hopefully, in the future, this can be applied to reward circuitry, including reward circuitry beyond just dopamine. Thanks very much for coming here, and I would like to acknowledge my advisors, all past and present, Dan and Inio, Paul, Helen, Arash, and Bob Schooler. I'd like to thank Dr. Lou King, who was the one who originally suggested when I had this framework but no mechanism for it, that I look at interactions within currents. And I want to thank Steve Grossberg for creating a department that took a chance on a graduate applicant with no real background in science and crazy ideas about aesthetics. I want to thank my family for supporting me ridiculously well through all of this. My coworkers and my colleagues, my friends, and particularly those people who have been crazy enough to try to date me through this. It's been a long process, but thank you all very much. And I also want to thank Mr. Kuykendall, who was my 5th grade science teacher, and was the first person ever to call me Dr.
But your unexpected questions give me the maximum dopamine.
Yes.
My question has to do with the, you have in your model a schizophrenic condition with combined with a rescue drug that
Yes.
basically remove the mismatch negativity but preserve mismatch assessment. That we may have understanding correctly.
Yes.
I'm just wondering what you think that would look like. How would you assess those two things?
Well, mismatch negativity is pretty easy to check. It's a novel paradigm. It doesn't require actually almost any kind of cognitive performance on the subject's part. So you can, as long as you can get somebody to sit in an EEG rig while you play some sounds in their ears. You can even do this with coma patients. Although the more abstract predictions don't seem to come through in them for some reason. But so you could very easily, with treated and untreated schizophrenic subjects, assess mismatch negativity in exactly the same way. Cognitively, in kind of a vague, hand-wavy way, I would expect that the ability to determine when mismatch is occurring or not occurring would help with delusional beliefs. In a more grounded way, I suppose, I would expect it would definitely help with working memory deficits. Because the ability to suppress that attentional orienting reflex to predicted or ignored inputs would really help preserve what is already in working memory. So you should be able to use that as a fairly grounded metric to assess whether there's comparison in one or improvement in one but not the other. Yes?
I will say that has been done.
Yeah. I should have mentioned that, yes.
So some researchers are finding the repetition suppression of neural response certainty standards, while others like you and Baldwin are finding this using positivity to repeating standards. How do you explain these differences?
So the positivity that we found was in the electrical fields. Actually, let me clarify that real quick. Are you aware of people who have found increasing negativities to repeating standards in EEG, or are we talking like fMRI? And...
No, finding that the repeating standard, the amplitude of negative signal, the N1
Yes.
decreases. So it becomes
Yes, N1 does seem to decrease. Yes. There's a separate repetition positivity that can be pulled out, but that is distinct. There's some controls that that guy did that actually in his paper distinguish it from the N1. So the N1 can be varying in one direction, while the repetition positivity can be varying in separate. I believe they might overlap. And to be honest, N1, like controlling for a component that partially overlaps with N1 is a very complicated thing, and there's a lot of people arguing back and forth about whether or not any given method for that is effective enough. So it's entirely possible that this might be, in part, influenced by N1 changes. I don't have a really good explanation for how, if it is exactly the same or largely overlapping with N1, you can find that N1s are reducing with repeated exposure, but the repetition positivity is increasing. I'm not really sure.
I haven't been able to figure it out in my mind.
Yeah. Honestly, the first thing that I would think to do is try to do more rigorous controls to differentiate the two and make sure that because if you are actually looking at two different components, particularly if they're generated in two different ways, then it's much easier for them to vary independently. But that's, until I've seen that, I'm not really sure I can come up with anything better. Yes. Oh.
Okay.
Wrapping this all together. A lot of lines of what you mentioned in your model, that it looks like this suppression of alpha comes from kind of a swamping out of the relevant signals. It reminds me of that Kyle Madison exhibition, just kind of put forth another analogy that resonated with me because he talked to him. And so his analogy was akin to me going to the garden for a Bruins Rangers game, and I'm a Rangers fan. And at some points during the game, these people over here chattering, there might be a chant going on, a couple hundred people. In the middle of all that kind of unsynchronized talking, I yell out, "Let's go Rangers," purely being broken. If, however, they get the chant going, all 18,000 people are chanting, "Let's go Bruins," and I shout, "Let's go Rangers," nobody's even hearing me.
Yeah.
And it's similar to what you're saying with the model. So, for you say that there's always some ignoring of the 10. But that implies there's some of 10 for every ignore.
Yeah.
And is there anything in your modeling or the theory that you can follow that assumes there has to be a signal passed? When you get that increased swamping, does it have to be sending information, or can it?
There's nothing in my model that requires that something be attended to before you can like initiate alpha in a different location. The basal ganglia control was built based on the notion of, well, mostly based on anti-saccade tasks, where you're learning that kind of control for a given task, in part through the attention and the reward when attention is directed in the correct place. So it certainly would help in the deployment of alpha. But yeah, the swamping, yeah, the notion that something must be passed through. I think I've been thinking about it as you're swamping, for instance, like your left visual inner field, but not your right, or like your visual, but not your auditory. So something else will be allowing information to pass through. In terms of passing it through the swamp system, or the swamped area in our models, regardless of them, that would be a matter of getting the phase exactly right. And there's some papers that indicate that the phase can itself also be learned. With repeated exposure, you can get the phase will start locking to stimulus onset if it's predictable. But I don't know enough about mechanisms for that, or have a good enough model of mechanisms for that to talk about how that might intentionally allow certain information through when you're otherwise ignoring everything.
All of your sensory input in favor of a representation from memory or even previous experience.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone's done a working memory task with a lot of multisensory distractors and looked for alpha increases correlating to like success at working memory retention.
I tried to do that, but it did not work at all. I know a lot more about the tasks together now.
Yes.
So, I'm curious about, so this idea of like being close enough to the expectation. So if it's close enough and it triggers this sort of yes/no response instead of like really detailed information, that almost seems to imply that you couldn't tell the difference between a perfect match and a close enough match.
Yeah.
So, are we just, is that just a
There are a lot of perceptual bias phenomena based around expectations. And if you expect something and the stimulus that you're presented with is a very close match, but not a perfect match, you tend to not notice the difference. Even if it is more than what would otherwise, like in an unprimed situation, be more than one J and D. And behaviorally, that
around that, is there a way to send in a close signal, or is that not necessarily?
I've been toying with the notion that like attention might like kind of help prevent some of this. For instance, if attention involves say like acetylcholine release in an area, you can the acetylcholine by shutting down the current can remove that bias and prevent things from being treated kind of in an ignored, expected way. There may also possibly be like, it certainly seems possible that there are bypass kind of channels where maybe like layer 6 pyramidal cells that don't quite reach as high with their apical dendrites might not get primed in the same way in the upper layers of the cortex, and could in turn represent the information without the priming bias.
So it shouldn't have been
Yeah. This is all kind of wild on-the-spot speculation, though. So, sorry, I don't mean to.
A lot of times looking at school modeling results, is that, this is really nice, it's really nice, and it fits the physiological data pretty well, which is also really nice. How strongly do you think this is what's actually happening versus a nice phenomenon that appears to match on the measures you're looking at?
Modelers should never answer questions.
I think I'm going to start my answer by talking about how all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So this is definitely not exactly what's happening, regardless. But it may be a useful way of thinking about what's happening. In particular, it may be useful in helping people to not overlook like individual spikes that might have more meaning.
Let me ask a more useful question. What experimental data would convince you that the sort of broad framework here is true? What would you want to like believe that this apparent modulation is sort of the core match mismatch?
So if you could set up an experiment with, say, like visual stimuli, where the location of the neurons representing the stimuli are well categorized and known, and you could record from those neurons and do this in an awake behaving animal where you could put it through, for instance, an oddball paradigm. If you then observed that mode switch reliably happening after, a certain number of standards, and growing increasingly strong, because for purposes of presentation, I showed kind of the extreme ends of the mode switch. There, you can have an M current that is just reducing spiking rate. And as you saw in like the retigabine rescue from DCP, you can get this kind of stuttering restoration of it without it being perfectly clean. And so I imagine that happens a lot of the time also. But if you do see this mode switch, and then if, just to make this experimental setup more complicated, you can also administer like a KCNQ antagonist and watch the mode switch vanish, then that would give me some pretty high confidence in this model. Yes?
Just thinking about the circuit, you mentioned that for C1 to have protection, and C3 input is very important. So, like, why you think C3 having the priming input
So
in circuit level?
So are you asking about C3's ability to generate predictions, or about why those synapses function as priming?
The first one.
Okay. So for that, I'm pretty much drawing on the work of John Lissman there, who has a series of models and papers on the ability of CA3 to generate kind of contextual predictions. Which fits even with like the CATS modeling from a spatial perspective, where CA3 is providing the context and the, like, to some extent, spatial expectations in his coincidence detection model. The architecture of like the connected CA3 and dentate gyrus is such that it's almost impossible not for it to be doing some kind of heteroassociative learning. Because of the recurrence that and because of the types of heavy learning that are going on there, you will get learning within that loop that activates the representation that reliably follows whatever representation you just had, or whatever, by representation, think like whatever set of neurons are active at or over a brief period of time. It's been very difficult to avoid that, actually, given the architecture. So that's why I'm willing to kind of run with that at this point. If it turns out CA3 isn't doing that, if it's somewhere else in the brain, that doesn't necessarily sync the whole model, especially since as if you remember, most of the diagrams I had just had a magic box that said memory prediction. So if it happens a different way, I think everything could adapt pretty well. But that seemed like the best hippocampal model available at the moment. So I kind of built off of that.
Okay, perhaps to make it less surprising, we can start with the first reader, except there is some unexpected. This is the second reader in the center to pull it from the third. But I think we
You get to start with questions, but Inio gets to interrupt you in order to surprise me.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Okay, so first, I just want to thank you for an uncommonly thoughtful and also uncommonly clear presentation
Thank you.
of some very tricky issues. And I'm actually shocked that you essentially answered all of my questions in your presentation. So I'm just going to ask some sort of really generic things. So one is with respect to sort of separating the sort of pure modeling core from the interpretation.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, I mean, is there anything in your model that doesn't have to be in a complete model, for say, of how ground neurons are being affected by multiple types of input?
In terms of the core model, I don't think so. And what defines a complete model is always going to be context dependent.
Yeah. So if that's true, then you can say that there are conditions.
Yes.
Under which, unless there's some other currents that aren't in the model. Okay?
And there are a great many currents that are not.
Yeah. Okay. But under some conditions, if you could say shut down the search, you could see these behaviors. Okay? You're confident that you will see these behaviors.
Yes.
Okay. So that's very reassuring to me. So then we come to the interpretation. Okay. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about sort of the background story for the interpretation, in particular, sort of the status right now of the predictive coding framework within the field.
So the predictive coding framework has, in recent years, mostly been advanced by Kristen, but has a long-standing tradition of basically assuming that the brain is a prediction machine, and it exists to refine its predictions and make better ones. And so it propagates predictions from a top-down perspective to the extent that you're willing to buy into like a hierarchical organization. And sensory input propagates bottom up, and at each level they're compared. And what moves on to the next higher level is not a sensory representation, but is actually just a different signal, like an error signal, what wasn't expected here. And that gets added to the expectations, and that becomes the representation for the next one. It's, in recent years, been expanded with some fairly grandiose claims, which suffer from possibly several of the same weaknesses I might have in terms of jumping from a core model to fairly broad interpretations in a cognitive sense. But it has claimed to be the first kind of grand unifying theory of brain function, which there was a recent PBS article or issue, I think, that was devoted to that, where there was a lot of controversy over like claims of grand unifying theory, and in particular over a lack of caution when it comes to different possible meanings of what it means to predict. Because if you're talking at a neural level, prediction is anything that's anticipatory. But cognitive predictions, actual expectations, could be an entirely different animal. Like they're going to be anticipatory, but like there's a whole lot of extra stuff there. And there have been challenges leveled that some of the predictive coding people are slipping between this a little too easily. I made some efforts to try to not do that and to distinguish between expectations and like anticipatory priming. But I'm pretty sure some of those accusations could also be leveled at this presentation. I'm hopeful though that like kind of the cellular and biological grounding for it can remain strong regardless of like the grander global claims. Because even if it turns out not to be a grand unifying theory, it could still be a very useful basis for a useful framework and models, especially at like a sensory perception level.
So, okay, I'm going to just end with the last piece of advice.
Okay.
It's been a while getting this thing written up. And I realized, hearing your talk today, that what we should have done is just have you prepare the talk, record the prose that you were speaking, and then use it to improve your written draft much more quickly.
That is possible. I mean, we should do that.
So,
Although I'm not sure the talk would have been half as good if I had not worked out the written draft.
yeah, okay. Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I want to second Dan's comment. Remarkable presentation. I experienced my own associative mismatch when I saw a draft dissertation.
Finally arriving.
For people in the room that might not be aware, I've been away for 5 years, away from the process. So I have a very good grasp of what you ended this talk with. And to me, that's kind of where your head was at, except you've done science in the meantime. Very, very well. I would also add, to the speculation about the 9-year timeline and this comment about maybe you should have given the talk earlier. There's another variable, which is I think you've done more presentations with this, at least, in terms of what I. So kudos for all of that. Your document has tables of many parameters, the vast majority of which are taken from the literature. So can you say a few words about the process of constructing the model in the various phases? And in particular, I'd be interested to know if you could comment on the robustness of parameter choices. How many 3 parameters are there? I mean, I couldn't figure that out.
Okay.
From
So,
please, no, that's it.
all right. So, assuming you're talking about the M-current-based model, that's the one with by far the most parameters. The rate-based models were very simple, but actually have more free parameters. One of the things that I came to love about the more detailed biological model, like, well, the neuron might have 25 or 30 parameters. They'll actually correspond to something that we have a way of measuring. And we might not have measured it, over a good representative sample of cells from whatever cortical area I'm looking at. But I can find something kind of similar and insert that. It really left me with basically 3 free parameters that I hadn't taken from anywhere. A couple of them were taken from other modeling studies where they had justified the choice of that. But there were 3 that I hadn't taken anywhere at all. Actually, no. Let me take that back. 6. And those are the lambdas for the different populations of inputs. Like when they're active, like priming, excitation, or the driving. Basically, what is the rate at which spikes are going to be coming in? And the synaptic weights, which even in the Bruno and Wang model, you need a some kind of scalar number to represent the general kind of strength and size of the synaptic connection. And so those were the ones that I mostly played with. Other than that, I believe just about everything in that model was taken from literature. The number of synaptic connections was a fairly arbitrarily chosen, reasonably large number, but I didn't really modify that. I can speak to it. It turned out to be very robust. Obviously, if there's too little priming, you don't get the code switching. And for most levels of priming, there exists some sufficient level of sensory input that can override the code switching, which I actually kind of think of as a feature. In that, even if I'm expecting an incredibly loud noise, a sufficiently intense noise or a stimulus can still startle me and override, for instance, any attempts at ignoring. Basically, what I found is you need kind of a ratio between the priming excitation and the priming inhibition. And as long as you keep that ratio, everything remains pretty robust. If you drop the driving excitation too low after priming, you get no response whatsoever. But that's kind of universal with any neuron. And we actually also did some noise evaluation, where we just injected white noise into the whole system and plotted like the 4 lines are the basically a confusion matrix for each injected noise amplitude that we looked at. And it's reasonably robust. In particular, what happens is the code switching kind of stops working. With enough extra injected noise, you get continued sporadic spiking, even in a primed condition, which means that eventually, if we consider like a true positive to be a primed sensory input, that the neuron then classified as expected or as primed by responding only with an onset of phasic spiking, the true positives fall off and false negatives step right into that gap. But I never found a level of noise that actually modified like the true negatives or the false positive. False negatives, false positives remain.
The switching and maybe touching a little bit on what Dan asked about the framework. In terms of the approach you've adopted, are there substantive differences with the Bayesian, kind of predictive coding framework, and if so, can you articulate what they are?
Yes. They mostly lie in the output of the comparison process. Bayesian ones and the neural implementations that are derived from the Bayesian ones, for the most part, send only an error signal. Whereas mine, this framework, is sending an error signal in like spike rate encoding, but it also sends a signal if everything is going okay. Which I think may be preferable in a number of cases because it gives you the information to, for instance, determine the difference between a strongly expected stimulus and a completely omitted stimulus. Things like that. You get an active confirmation that at this point in time, your expectations have been met. However, it's a very small signal compared to the error signal in most cases. So while it's a functional difference, it's one that I think could easily be fit into their general framework without disrupting it.
Thank you. Abby asked another question that I intended to ask you, sort of in subjunctive, which is what experimental test would you do? Can you comment a little bit? Do you have specific plans going forward? What you will do?
Well, what I will do will be determined to some extent by where I can get a postdoc position, what kind of grants and equipment they have available. But yeah.
Are you looking to join an experiment per se, or do you want to keep kind of
Ideally, I would keep working in a more modeling framework, but experimental things might be helpful.
My last question is just predicated by my own experience of working in a context of very frequently pushing immense sprawling papers with lots of different stuff in it that uses the audience and so forth. Have you thought about what might be some minimal publishable units in your work?
Yes.
That could be rolled out. Where would the break?
Well, Dan has offered some sage advice on that, specifically about like not starting with the framework, unlike this kind of presentation, but like without proposing a whole separate framework, I can propose just a model of a more efficient single cell comparator for the mismatch negativity. And that could be done in a very standard paper length. I could propose a similar model of CA1 hippocampal mismatch detection. And there's some hope left in me that we might be able to get the alpha stuff out the door eventually as well. And that especially would fall neatly into one or maybe two publications, like the saturation-based alpha approach, and then possibly also the incurrent.
Okay. Well, again, thanks very much.
Okay.
So very nice presentation and very I should say, so I'm not quite used to doing it this way. There's a whole bunch of competencies which I'm probably not going to remember over here now.
Absolutely, yeah.
Someone else will send you. So I guess a few of the bigger questions. So just taking a step back. In the beginning, you kind of had, I think, a gut reaction against the idea of there being separate circuits almost copying what one circuit is doing.
Yes.
But in some sense, and maybe you can look at the hippocampal model, to generate a prediction, you've almost got a copy of a circuit. And for every cell you're saying, I predict that cell is going to now receive input. Well, there has to be a cell sending that message.
Yes.
And so how do you not have the number of cells sending the message equal to the number of cells receiving the message?
You can have.
And if you've got 10 different cells which receive input, there must be 10 different cells saying,
You can, if you're moving from, say, an abstract kind of sequence being recognized to a more low-level sensory prediction, in particular, you can have a significant amount of fan-out from one representation in an abstract area being primed for prediction to a great many cells in a lower area, like the number of cells in, for instance, like I2 that are active when I'm expecting to see, say, like a horse, might be relatively small compared to the number of cells that are doing edge detection while I actually see a horse in like V1. And so you can have like a fan out between those.
I think it's the way you're priming a particular cell at the level.
Mhm.
It doesn't need to just know a force. It needs to know exactly. There are maybe 1,000 different things. I'll use an edge there.
Yes.
So don't you then get
Think about that for a second. So if I have a representation of a horse, might kind of, so you have like, yeah, like if you have like this going down to lower level representations, there might be other things that do still activate that. Like the edge of a car might exist in the same position as the edge of a horse. Yes. Yes. Which is where, unless you're expecting the horse in a very particular position, you probably wouldn't get strong priming of like particular edge locations. And as I was talking about with the possible kind of chaining of these systems through neocortical mismatch, you could have unexpected responses at the level of, say, edge detection. But if we were to add, say, like an extra level on top of this and had it prime one of these higher level representations, say, force. Then these unexpected would just be the new sensory spike trains driving the comparators at this higher level. And it would transform at this level into the like onset spiking. I believe you can work that out with kind of a pyramidal structure in terms of the number of neurons.
The example you gave, I believe, dentate gyrus and CA3
Yes.
have order of magnitude more cells, and everyone's doing prediction that
Yes.
CA1, which is
You do go down to CA1 and then fan back out with the output from CA1. It's possible that most of my thinking about how this might chain together and the number of neurons required has been from the neocortical perspective. It is entirely possible that in the hippocampus that falls apart a little bit, especially since you're not going to be having multiple regions chained together in the same way. You just have your dentate and CA3 producing predictions in your CA1. All right.
So I guess this is a little bit related because what you're showing is basically having label line coding at some level. Label line is really inefficient because if you have 20 neurons, the label lines are different stimuli. Whereas if you have distributed coding, even though binary, you have 2 to the power of 20, which is a million different represents.
So
do you think that's perhaps something that as you go higher up, distributed coding is likely, but something about the lower levels, you have to have label line?
well, for lower level sensory areas, you definitely do see some information being carried by label lines, like visual input, like the particular spike train coming in your optic nerve conveys information about say, like edge intensity or stuff like that. But the fact that it's located in your upper left visual field is a function of the channel. I played around a little bit with different types of neural representations because a lot of this, for ease of presentation, is kind of presented as though there are basically grandmother cell representations going on here. But I believe you could actually get this kind of effective priming and the results from this priming in, for instance, like population-coded things, vector-encoded populations, and even like heavy cell assemblies, as long as the priming hits the combination of neurons that needs to be active, that they could still send out just their one spikes rather than like a more complicated spike train. Okay.
So is this related? Because I think you showed some step function activation, so you can get some things that are getting 10 inputs that may all.
Yes.
And current of those that get 12. So
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It basically makes it much less kind of noisily smooth and probabilistic and much more like an absolute threshold. And this is stuff I've toyed with, but I haven't done a really rigorous analysis of. So I have suspicions, but I don't have strong claims that like it would work with more complicated coding techniques or representation.
So in a different area, so I know very little about EEG detectors and so on. So you're showing kind of isopotential lines.
Yes.
But it's electric field that's being detected. But you plot everything in volts, which is a measure of potential.
So the quasi-static electric field is usually measured in volts by the electrodes. So like the electrode trace generally is never going to be whole volts, but like very small volt-based units. And my physics understanding I think is not sufficient to explain why the quasi-static electric field is determined in volts. But I can provide you with references for the explanations that I used for like deriving that.
I guess how sensitive is it to the model cell?
It's very sensitive to the distance between the apical and basal points. So that actually required a reasonable amount of retuning of those like 6' parameters when I switched from hippocampus to layer 2/3 neocortical because the cells are much shorter. And so the electric field, yes, but and obviously it'll be sensitive to the transmembrane currents, so like ion channel activation is primarily what's driving that.
Perhaps this can explain. When you go back to your primary example, I don't know if it's easy to get to.
Oh, yeah.
But essentially, you show the electric field in the prime case rising about 100 milliseconds before there's any spikes. So is that because your prediction current comes in 100 milliseconds ahead?
It does come in.
And that's what drives this huge electric field response.
Yes.
Which is why you can dissociate the spike in your case of drug recovery, dissociate the spike from the electric field because you're getting all the synaptic currents still. But
Yes. Yeah. The fields are driven by the synaptic currents rather than the spiking
because you
output.
have the field coming at 200 milliseconds, but the
Yes.
spikes.
Yes. And I believe that is about accurate, the amount of lead time I gave. I played around with it. You can get a mode switch in the firing with less lead time on the priming. But it was a little bit more robust if I gave it a bit longer. So I kind of did that when I was modeling.
So I was just wondering if the 100 milliseconds is based on the data that we're kind of predicting 100 milliseconds into the future, or this, I'm sure John data cycle one, cycle one, or if it's just purely computational.
It works better, was actually how I found it. It is not terribly far off of the scale of, for instance, predictive alpha that was induced in some of Lisa's experiments leading up to an anticipated stimulus, which gives me some vague hope that it might not be completely arbitrary. But for the most part, I just assumed that somewhere between 50 and 100 milliseconds seemed not unreasonable, and so I tried it out. I would like to be able to actually pin that down to something measured, but there's not. Given that this framework is not yet widely accepted, very few people have undertaken experiments to measure what would be considered in this framework only the priming synapses.
So then, here's my final question for you. So with pharmacological manipulations, often they have multiple effects.
Yes.
So you mentioned one with the KCNQ. So the KCNQ conductance, this is synonymous with the MCOM?
Yes.
Yeah. So the drugs that increase or decrease that conductance, if it only affects that current, then it's a great test. But do you know anything about it?
Yeah, they definitely affect other things. They will have impacts on inhibitory interneurons. They'll have impacts on the earlier excitatory neurons, firing rates. They modulate a lot of things. And in particular, the KCNQ agonist also seems to have kind of some secondary and tertiary impacts where the way it's usually talked about in terms of treatment for schizophrenia is that it has a strong impact on the dopaminergic system, which then down modulates dopamine release across the brain, which in turn will once again impact the neocortical cells in terms of their firing patterns. And I have not simulated that out to a sufficient level yet, I suppose, for my own certainty. This was very much a first pass at, we know that in the immediate, it has this impact on ion channels in that one cell.
So maybe as a final follow-up then, there are mouse models of schizophrenia. Do you know, in a very different field here, if they're considered at all applicable to real schizophrenia, and then if testing, you could promote, you could overexpress or underexpress these channels in the mouse model.
Yeah.
That's cool. And would it actually be related?
My understanding, although the genetic engineering of mice is not my strong suit, my understanding is that it's probably feasible in a mouse model at this point to specifically modulate these channels. I've seen models where they knocked out casein and Q, but that causes some rather drastic developmental difficulties. So it becomes difficult to do any kind of good behavioral or like it is a model of any kind of normal. Mouse models of schizophrenia, to my understanding, the extent to which they're accepted as valid depends fairly heavily on the school of thought that one holds with regard to the underlying causes of schizophrenia. Like I said, one of the most common ones is chronic PCP administration, which is an NMDA blockade. And so for people who really like the NMDA hypofunction model of schizophrenia, they seem to be happy to argue that that's a good model in a mouse. For people who dislike that version of schizophrenia, they become more skeptical. Fortunately, until we have a better understanding of exactly what the underlying mechanism of schizophrenia is, it's going to be really hard to evaluate even animal models.
The problem is the cognitive deficits of mice are already below.
Yeah, their working memory is not very high to begin with.
Yes, Stefan, first of all, thank you and congratulations. Whenever I get the past visit in the summer, when I have focused obsession and the law here it comes again. But I want to know that I really enjoyed reading for the generality of what you found, and it jives a lot with our own thinking about the patterns of connections in the cortex.
Yes.
Which sometimes we see the limitations of these coding in stereo form, so that there are a lot of possibilities to really do this. And the code switching particularly is a very efficient way of modeling the nervous system in a consistent way. So, that's very nice because people have shown this in the cortex, they showed it in the campus, and in thalamus, people have shown that there is a code switching in the thalamus. And so that's very interesting because we're trying to actually link the thalamus and other structures with the cortex to understand more globally what happens. But there is some work in the amygdala, and people claim that there are tonic firing neurons and there are neurons that fire, the bursters they call them, or something like that. And they claim that they are separate. Do you have any thoughts about that and how do you might influence the system?
So given what I've just presented, the very first thought in my head is, I wonder to what extent they actually are separate. Like, if you can switch between this, the amygdala doesn't seem so alien to what we've been modeling that like it would be impossible. And if it can switch, then that might allow for a much more kind of dynamically interesting model of what's going on in the amygdala. Unfortunately, all of the tie-ins to reward and emotional processing kind of remained in the future directions section. I figured I didn't have another 6 years to stay here and work on this. So I haven't yet studied like models of the amygdala as much as I would like to. So I don't know. I would very much like to sit down with you and like maybe Johan and talk about that and see how that could, like, what would actually follow if they were able to switch, and in turn, what might be serving as a priming function for them. Because it's my understanding of the amygdala while limited, such that I doubt it's going to be priming specific sensory features so much as like, yeah, more general balances and things. I wish I could talk more about that, but I don't know enough about the amygdala.
If we take the whole physiology, and it's not that old, but it's program that, say that maybe it's correct, could it be that it still functions in a certain way? In other words, there's something special about the amygdala that has to have this separate
Yeah, that doesn't.
information on the red.
I could certainly imagine that. For instance, if it doesn't have strong access to predictions, or like Paul was saying, if the predictions that it's dealing with are structured in such a way that like you don't actually gain anything from setting up these labeled lines. There are certainly scenarios where that would be the case. And depending on the functionality of the amygdala, it might fall into that, where you're not trying to predict many lower features from one higher level prediction, but you're just predicting one straightforward reaction from many inputs or something like that.
Yes, so
Yeah.
what's danger or what?
Exactly.
Something
Yeah.
like that, in other words.
Yeah. So the given the spread going in the opposite direction, I haven't actually done anything with numbers on this, but my intuition is that that might be one of the situations where like the efficiency savings start to vanish.
Actually, in the example you gave, from the beginning about thinking milk,
Mhm.
because what we don't have some case books,
Yeah.
and they see differences. They actually do those suppression.
Oh, nice.
Very fast.
I think that's pretty good.
Yeah. But still, getting amygdala response to that kind of associated mismatch. That would be great data to have.
And in terms of the procedure of prediction that other people asked earlier on, is it even biologically useful to be exactly precise? I mean, you have to react to something. You need to know exactly what it is before you react. If somebody darts in front of you, does it matter if it's a deer or a bear or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah, when it comes to like I guess the kind of perceptual bias due to the expectations. Yeah, I've generally thought of it as behaviorally useful if it is close enough that you can functionally treat it as though it's what was expected. Yeah, especially when the alternative is a mismatch with attentional orienting and like some delayed processing. For you to be surprised and have your attention dragged away every time, like a shadow on a leaf was not exactly what you predicted, would be functionally very damaging to anything trying to navigate an environment. So there's one of the things that I find really interesting is the way we seem to have kind of an adaptive threshold for that. Like I was saying, when I'm paying attention to like wood grain on a table, if there's like a discontinuity in the grain, I'll notice that. If I'm not paying strong attention to the texture, then like it's all going to be just kind of merged in as functionally close enough. All the way up to like when I'm walking home from work, I'll very often walk the entire way, end up in my apartment, and have no real memory of that day's actual walk because it was all just functionally close enough to what I was expecting, even though it was totally different people than every day before. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask our quick audience to leave their room for the members to make a decision.
We're actually doing it on the way out.
I'm getting.
Oh, it's-